This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs.
So this film that we just watched is part of a 3-film series, as everyone knows, called Dreaming Palestine, Occupation, Exile, and Return. I want to take inspiration from that title for my questions tonight, and I'll start with occupation. Since this film takes place in Nazareth, which is inside what some people might call present-day Israel, it occurred to me that there might be some problem with the word occupation. So oftentimes when people refer to the occupied territories, they're talking about the West Bank, they're talking about Gaza. They're referring with that term to the occupation that happened in 1967. But here we really have a story about another occupation, the occupation that happened in 1948. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit, or if you have any thoughts about the problematic with the term occupation. You know, how are we supposed to use it? And if we use it to describe the occupied territories, to describe, if we use that phrase to describe the West Bank and Gaza, then are we erasing this occupation that happened before?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I thought maybe one of the ways I could answer that is, if you notice, the film is subtitled The Biography of a Present Absentee. And the term present absentee is really important here because it's a legal term, and it refers to a law that was passed in 1950, which basically said that if you were Palestinian but not on the lands that you were claiming as your property, you became disenfranchised from them. So I think one of the ways to understand the story of Palestine and Palestinians is to really try and grasp at the ways that since 1948, but intensively since 1948 and even before, the struggle with Zionism has really entailed people being separated from their land and also being separated from one another. So in this story, one of the important aspects of it is that the mother is writing to her sister-in-law who's in Amman. And the story of the people in this film is the story of the 150,000 Palestinians who, after 1948, remained in what would then become Israel, which is 80% of historic Palestine, and that are today 1.2 million people. They make up about 20% of the Israeli population. And so they constitute a bit of a threat to the self-definition of Israel as both Jewish and democratic, because they are sort of, as one scholar named Shira Robinson has recently called it, citizen strangers. So they're citizens who have become estranged on their own land. And I think in order to really think through the struggle over Israel-Palestine, one really has to grasp this story. So there is the story of the occupation after 1967, but we can't really understand it without beginning in 1948, beginning with what Palestinians call the catastrophe, or the Nakba of 1948, when 700 to 800,000 Palestinians become refugees, 150,000 Palestinians become present absentees or citizen strangers in the state of Israel, and the remaining are refugees outside. So yeah, I don't think we can really talk about the occupation without getting at that historical trajectory.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to this analysis as to the question of the problematic of limiting the notion of occupation to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that occupation is not limited to those geographies or to the geography of historic Palestine itself. There's the potential in the way that we name things and in the vocabularies we use to describe them for all kinds of erasure. In any geopolitical moment, the way that our terminologies connote don't always reflect the political approach we might otherwise support. So with occupation, I think it's something that can be inclusive not only of the West Bank and Gaza or the Palestinian citizens of Israel represented in the film, but of the Palestinians in refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, or even those of Palestinian origin in the West who deal in different ways, but deal nevertheless with some of the problematics of the conflict and deal with their own modes of repression vis-a-vis their relationship to their ancestral land. So, I mean, you know, I believe that the problem you raise of the terminology of occupation being limited to the West Bank and Gaza in ways that it mightn't necessarily be, or really being addressed in part by the emphasis that exists now on binationalism, you know, as an ultimate solution to the conflict. And I think any emphasis on sort of a one-state solution or binationalism or a federation or whatever you want to call it is, at the very least, a tacit acknowledgement that 1948 is still occupied, but I would say even more precisely, colonized. Right? You know, and I don't know that the term occupation quite gets at a system of colonization in the way that it needs to be. And so it's in the same way you could say that you know, it's not much of a convincing political proposition to say that North America is still occupied, right? But to say that North America is still colonized is something that resonates in a particular way, and I think that there's something comparable with that terminology that can be applied to 48 Palestine also.
Mm-hmm. So moving on to my next question, and you've both gestured to it, about exile. Palestinians have been displaced in so many different ways that the term exile really encompasses a variety of experiences and relationships to Palestine. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe what are some of those. I don't know that everyone in the audience is necessarily familiar with all of the kinds of exile that Palestinians experience based on their geographic or territorial relationship to Palestine. And also, how do you think that affects the, how should I say, the Palestinian political psyche or the ability for Palestinians to develop a kind of coherent political agenda with all of these various experiences of exile that don't necessarily map onto one another?
I'll let you go first this time.
It's a great question, but one that doesn't have a simple or direct answer. I can talk about it a little bit from the point of view of somebody who spent a decent amount of my professional life engaged in literary criticism, but exile has been a profound motif in Palestinian literature, Palestinian political writing, and then as we see here in Palestinian film, Edward Said wrote often and very beautifully in moments of exile and of sort of the kind of burden of worldliness that exists for Palestinians, which in other ways he saw as a blessing. Darwish also, spoke often of Palestine not as a geography that's inhabited by the Palestinian, but how Palestine exists as an idea to the Palestinians, as something that we wear as a charm on necklaces, something that we wear on T-shirts, something that we chant as slogans, which doesn't and didn't for Darwish make it any less real. Right? He is just pointing out that Palestine exists in particular ways in the Palestinian cultural imagination, even for those who didn't grow up on the land, or in some cases who haven't even visited the land. So, for me, one of the main features of exile is the way that it functions in the Palestinian cultural and political imaginary.
Exile. Okay, Steve and I were just talking on our way over here, and I was telling him that one of the things that to add on to Edward Said that has always really stayed with me is his sort of attempt to explain how Palestinians, one of the central kind of emotive imperatives has been around the right to a remembered presence. And I think in the way that if you see this film, or if you've been to refugee camps in Lebanon or in Syria, there's multiple kinds of exile. So there's the kind of exile if you're a Palestinian in Israel, where it's still the place that you've inherited in your memory, but it isn't in many ways. If you're a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, for those of you who have ever visited these refugee camps, you'll often find that people recreate their neighborhoods according to the villages that they're from. And this actually happens with internal refugees inside 1948, inside Israel. I think for a lot of us in diaspora, one of the things that we have to face is, while we call for the right of return, there is also in front of us, in so many ways, the impossibility of return. So I'm a Palestinian, and my family is from, was born in my parents were born in 1944. So they were children in the Nakba in 1948. And I was born in Lebanon, and later, many years later, would marry a Palestinian from Nazareth, actually the Palestinian who did the set decor for this film, which was very beautiful, right? One of the things that's been very, very instructive for me has been that I've made a home with him in the city of Haifa, which is where my family is from. And in so many deep ways, I learned new things about being in exile there, because many family homes that still are standing, my grandmother's school that is now a museum, I have returned in some ways, and in other ways it's an impossible return. So I think that's one of the things, the kind of burden of worldliness, perhaps. The other thing I want to say, to get back to the current political moment. One of the problems with Oslo from 1993, when the Palestinians, when the Palestinian Authority began the so-called peace process in 1993, one of the main weaknesses and sticking points are the ways in which the Palestinians in the refugee camps have been and continue to be erased from the process of this so-called peace process. And to understand this conflict, one has to really, really grasp at the importance of the claims and demands of now what are now millions of people who are refugees, and their demands to be able to return to their lands.
Yeah, I mean every Palestinian by the age of 2 or 3, sometimes earlier, knows what her or his ancestral village is. You see it in the camps, and you see it in diaspora. You see it within the West Bank and within quote-unquote Israel proper itself. And so these colonial erasures of Palestinian history and Palestinian geography are always tenuous, because even villages that have long been destroyed or that no longer exist remain alive. And so these ties of ancestry are a profound component of what it is to be Palestinian. So even removed from the land itself, right? The geography is absolutely crucial to one's sense of self. So that there are over 500 villages, at least, that were depopulated in 1948, but those villages remain alive in very distinct ways. So if you go to Shatila, for example, just south of Beirut, a Palestinian refugee camp, and ask a 5-year-old where they're from, they will tell you their ancestral village in Palestine. They will say Shatila only in a specific context of being asked, within sort of the Beirut metropolitan area. But generally, when it's almost understood inherently that when I'm in conversation with somebody I know to be of Palestinian origin, and I ask that person, where are you from, that person is going to tell me where his or her ancestral home is, and then only after will tell me that they're from Ramallah or Amman or Beirut or whatever the case may be.
Given these very strong ties that last generations, I mean, people who have been in the Shatila refugee camp for 2 generations, children who have never seen Palestine and might never see Palestine, have those ties. I think it really puts front and center the concept of return, because the thing that I think unites all of these different experiences of exile is the certainty that we're all returning. So what does return look like? That's the question. What does it look like? How can we imagine return? And Shirin, you gave us an example from your own life of how, when you can return, it's not going to be the same. Of course, you're not returning to the same thing. But even still, people are holding this aspiration, this desire. They're not letting go. And so, what would that look like if that were to come to fruition?
What would it look like? I think that and this is something that we were talking about earlier, and something that Steve touched on at an early after your first question, which is what can Palestine mean to people who aren't connected to it? And I think one of the things it can mean is to really try and imagine a just future. And I think imagining a just future for me, must necessarily include what are now 3 or 4 generations of Israeli Jews who live on the land of Palestine and who live on the land of Israel. I think we have to find ways to think through what does a just future mean for Palestinians in this context of now 100 years of settler colonialism. I think to think through that, we've sort of been quite burdened by both kind of the geopolitical interest in Israel-Palestine, and then a great deal of, essentially the story of Palestine, the story of Israel, is the story of our modern day times, because it's linked in a very painful and tragic way to the history of European Jews. And it's linked very closely as well to the history of the Shoah, which is what scholars who are critical, Holocaust studies scholars who are critical, what they call the Holocaust is Shoah, which is also catastrophe. And I think we have to think through the ways in which these catastrophes are linked. And I think we have to think through a future in which everyone who lives on this land, who has the right to return to this land, are equal citizens. And as the conditions as it stands now is that there are a set of laws if you are an Israeli Jew, and there are a set of laws if you are a Palestinian. And that condition isn't sustainable. So I think the question of what does return look like is a really powerful one, and I think we have to imagine it very creatively. But I think to continue in the condition that we are now is a frightening prospect for everyone. And I think this is also something we had talked about earlier, which is that the condition that we are in now, and one of the things that occupation doesn't capture, is that the condition in Israel-Palestine now is really a one-state condition. It isn't a one-state solution, it is a one-state condition in which the state of Israel is basically in charge and in control of all of the people living in historic Palestine, in Israel proper, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. So these two separate legal frameworks isn't sustainable, and I would hope that what return looks like would be a just future for everyone on this piece of land.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. In both of your answers, you gestured toward the way that I guess the futures or the destinies of Palestinians and Israelis, or Palestinians and even Jewish people around the world, are very, very tightly intertwined to the extent that they really can't be separated anymore. There was some representation of that in the film that we watched tonight, a lot. And in most instances in the film, unlike the reality that we know today, the Palestinian character has the upper hand in a way. And so toward the end in the emergency room, you see the young Palestinian guy, and he's handcuffed to an Israeli police. And the Israeli police is supposed to be dragging him around. He's obviously under arrest, but it's the young guy who's dragging him wherever he wants to. He wants to get a cigarette. He wants to say hi to his friends. There's another scene in which the father wants to go save the Israeli soldier, which is also chock full of other kinds of interesting ideas. But the first soldier is telling him, "Don't get out of the car, turn around, go," and the guy's just completely not listening to him. And then there's the beginning and close to the end imagery of the Israeli chauffeur who's driving around the Palestinian filmmaker. I mean, he's the chauffeur. And all of these images show a kind of relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, which is at least not the Israelis driving things. I mean, except for the chauffeur's literally driving the car, but he's even in sort of a service position. In other words, the Israelis and the Palestinians are obviously having to negotiate this movement together. What do you think about the choices that the filmmaker made in portraying the relationship that way? Do you think it's accurate? Do you think it's farcical? Is it a productive point of departure for conversations about how the two peoples can move forward?
So I want to say a couple of things about the film and about Eli Sleiman. First, I think the role of silence in this film is very important. And I think that is an important move in and of itself, because this is a much talked about place, right? And a lot of ideology and a lot of dogma. And I think part of what Sleiman is doing in this film is he's producing a work of art that's a film, and he, I think, would want to be appreciated as an artistic filmmaker in many of the same ways that Mahmoud Darwish used to always say, "I want to be recognized as a poet, not just a Palestinian poet." So, right. So there's part of that. There's part of this that's really going on here. The other part, I think, that I really appreciate about this film and about Sleiman's work more generally, you know, and he has this sort of relentlessly silent role, right? He doesn't speak, and he does this in each of the films of the trilogy. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that he's a little bit decentering sort of the narrative of the colonizer and his shadow. He's decentering all of that, and it's sort of less about that relationship as the only way to think about the past, the present, and the future, and more about sort of how do we make sense of and critique and laugh about our realities. And I think this is what you know, you can see in a lot of Palestinian art and film and music, contemporary art, is humor. And I think that humor, even if it's black humor sometimes, is one of the ways to perhaps imagine the metaphor of return, right? Mm. Allowing ourselves to laugh a little bit about the absurdity of these situations. So the way that I read this film is through those lenses. It's not a map for how is the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, and what should it look like. Do you see what I mean? I mean, I think, you know, the scene around the fishing and this repetitive sort of nuisance, right? It's not threatening. It's not necessarily. It's a nuisance of just, you know, leave us alone, right? But it's a very kind of imbricated in this kind of daily life, and in that sense, much more complicated, much more mundane struggle. You know, and I think the way he ends it with staying alive is pretty potent, right? He's just like, we're staying alive and we're doing this, and I think one of the ways to do that is perhaps to step out of the kind of relationship to the you know, this kind of box of the colonial and his shadow and the colonial and his other, and to just say, let's do something a bit different.
Yeah, it's the questions of the film being farcical or accurate are a lot more complicated than they first seem. The film is absolutely farcical. There's no doubt about that. At the same time, along with its farcical characteristics, I noticed that Sleiman is, you know, to this sentimental viewer anyway, really skilled at creating a type of affect. You know, I thought that some of the scenes with the father were remarkably moving. Some of them were really sad. You know, there's a lot poignant here, and he manages to deliver that poignancy without any sort of cloying dialogue, or hell, without even any dialogue at all sometimes. And in terms of its accuracy, it's accurate to the logic or illogic of the type of story that he wants to tell. It doesn't matter whether it's accurate or not. I did note that for a film that is so interested in the kind of decentering that Shireen analyzed, it's interesting the way that it moves through history chronologically. You know, from I guess 1948-ish until the late, you know,
early 90s, yeah.
Or was it early 90s?
Or maybe later, yeah.
Yeah, I thought sometime in the 2000s.
Yeah,
I didn't
2000s,
know.
yeah.
You know,
Post-Oslo, yeah.
Not quite sure. I mean, there weren't enough cues. You know, maybe some internet browsing or something would have helped. But,
right.
You know, it's accurate in the sense that he's telling a story that is particular to his experience, but one that at the same time has the ability very much to be universal. The story that we can recognize beyond, I think, a particular engagement with the conflict or particular national boundary. It's if you believe that the film works, right, as a bit of art or as a representation of a particular story, then yeah, it's accurate.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for obliging my questions. And now we'll turn to the audience for any of your questions.
I was taken by Shireen's description of the film, and I agree with you that too often we see the bombs and the terror in these narratives. And for me, the film was kind of deafening in its quietness. And actually, I think Stephen will probably be able to answer this. It struck me that, particularly at the point where the mother is sitting on the balcony and she's older and there are fireworks and she turns away from them, this is also about indigeneity. It's somebody who has not moved, people who have not moved, but who have been unsettled consistently and constantly.
Right.
And it struck me that in the 80s and the 90s, the major discourse on Palestine was through a critique of colonialism, through the work of Edward Said. It was all about worldliness. But there's a new alliance and solidarity with indigenous studies.
Absolutely.
Now, I think, which is very interesting, we've already brought up the comparative indigeneity. So I was wondering if you could speak to what does it mean to be indigenous in Palestine?
Wow,
That's a big question.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's a big question. Did you want to dive in?
No,
You want me to-
all yours. Yeah.
Oh boy, okay. It means, first and foremost, in my opinion, locating your very sense of being and your sense of ancestry in that particular geography, which isn't necessarily exclusive to Palestinians. When I contemplate this question, I realize just how difficult it can be to answer. You think of a notion of a Jewish diaspora. Well, a notion of diaspora can't exist without the corresponding notion of a homeland. So there are really profound and, in some cases, compelling notions of Jewish indigeneity there. But those notions of Jewish indigeneity also precede Zionism. And I don't see a compelling narrative of indigeneity in Zionist discourses. I see them in certain religious and cultural discourses that exist in Jewish communities. And those are the ones that I find more compelling. I think sometimes of the mechanics of indigeneity in the region. The way that, I don't know, the way that the Israeli army bulldozes olive groves. That to me is about as damning a commentary on the Israeli relationship with the land as you can ever possibly find, because no Palestinian would ever destroy a healthy olive tree. Right? Though, the way that Israel, the Israeli state, sort of plans communities, not with any eye towards being integrated with the landscape, but with the express purpose of demographic manipulation. That strikes me as remarkably important. And also the way that Palestinian identity itself is tied into things that are ancient or established. The terracing in certain villages, the maintenance of olive trees, which, if you haven't been fortunate enough to work with olive trees, you know that they take years, 20, 30 years sometimes to bear fruit, but then they can bear fruit for centuries. There are olive trees that have been dated, around 2,000 years. They're absolutely remarkable, and they're symbols not only of a landscape, but they're symbols of a cultural and geographical and in many ways political identity. Think of the way that Palestinian place names are so crucial to the landscape, and the way that Palestinian surnames themselves are often place names. The way that we're named after the geographies with which we're associated. Names like Makdisi, you know, is you know, a place name that's associated with Jerusalem, for example. But you know, and it goes on and on. Salaita is a place name. It's a place name in Jordan, right? But you know, we see the ways that you cannot separate any functional understanding of Palestinian culture or Palestinian identity from the histories and the ecology of this particular landscape. Quite simply, and to put it crudely, Palestinians didn't have to reconceptualize villages in Hebraized fashion, or turn to you know, biblical or scriptural descriptors in order to create a sense of place. The sense of place is precisely what has constituted Palestinian culture. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I'm kind of spitballing. But I could go on for like another 7 hours, but I'll give Shireen a...
Well, I just want to say about that scene, because one of the things that's really, really crucial about this film is his play with the music. And each of the pieces really have very specific significance for, you know, consumers of this music, of the 70s, the 80s, the 40s, right? So it's very, very, very well kind of placed and thought out soundscape in this film. And one of the things that's going on when the fireworks are happening and she has the picture of her husband, and she has everybody sort of, you know, moving around her, and the music that cuts out, which is the music that he's listening to as he's going to Ramallah in the service, is a song that's saying, "Leave me alone, Sibuni Anas." And it's, for me, that's what that scene was about. It was about, you know, because there is a lot of this that is also autobiographical. So while a lot of this is kind of playing on the absurd, he's also, much of these stories are stories that his father told him before 1948. And it is a commemoration of his mother's death. So it's always also about death and dying and just normal, everyday kind of people things, right? And so I think for me, that moment was a very powerful kind of statement about death and mourning and her missing her man and her love. And the thing I wanted to say about indigeneity, which I know much less about, so I won't say much about it at all, except that one of the things I think to think through, and this is something that I learned from Ella Shohat sort of early on, and something I struggle with a lot in my own work, because I write about the Mandate period, and I've tried to avoid what Edward Said called the malicious simplifications of the category of Arab and Jew, which only became mutually exclusive as a result of Zionism and Arab nationalism. And there's a way that Ella Shohat, in her writings about what it means to be an Iraqi Jew, you know, does this amazing thing where she sort of switches the order, the biblical order of at the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept for Zion, and she says, at the rivers of Zion we sat and wept for Babylon. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking through what does indigeneity mean. And here I do want to get back to the broader Arab context in which now displacement has become, I mean, you know, when I talk to Syrians, I'm like, my Nakba, your Nakbas, you know, or Iraqis, Syrians, you know, the you know, Christian communities in Mosul that have been around forever. So I think that there's a deeper, longer, difficult conversation in which we are really thinking through what the last 2 centuries have meant for people in the Middle East. And then I think the solidarity building is really around settler colonialism for me. Like that's you know, and I was telling Steve before, I was up in Oakland this weekend and at this Black Palestinian New Solidarity mural in Oakland, and I saw this young man wearing a shirt that said, Palestinian, born in California, bred in Palestine. I was like, oh, I need that shirt. But you know, I mean, I think the conversations around what does it mean to be a survivor of settler colonialism and what does it mean to be in an ongoing relationship to settler colonialism, and for me being back in California after a very long absence, one of the things that's been so painful is the ways in which settler colonialism has been so successful here that it's almost invisible, right? It's hard to call it out, right? And I think that's the work that I think Palestine can help with and can contribute to.
We'll have one more question.
Celia.
My question was partly answered because I was going to ask about the music and how the remarks were about the silence, but the film didn't have in dialogue, it had in music. So since I'm illiterate in the language of the music here, I was very curious, particularly the first piece when the soldiers ransack the things in the house, and there's the vitriol, is that vitriol? And the man, you know, listens to what is that music?
It's it's a singer called Asmahan, and she's singing Elbi Dalili, which is My Heart is My Guide, and she's playing with the tango music that's so popular at that time, and I love it. It's really beautiful, and that's what he's listening to in the car outside of the pharmacy.
That's exactly what I was going to ask. If it was the same song, but it was the song that the Israelis and he liked. So both of them. I mean, what is the meaning? Because they were taking the things out of the house and they play the music, the soldiers.
Yeah. I mean, I'll let...
I don't know. Is it? It's an interesting... I was thinking about that scene. Is it... I don't feel like we're certain that the Israelis necessarily like the music, the soldiers. They're playing it, but they don't seem to be reactive to it. They're more reactive to the objects that they're stealing.
Right. Yeah, and he's doing this kind of, funny dance where they're doing the folding with the curtain, and it's kind of, Woody Allen, Charlie Chaplin type of, right? But, do Israelis like Arabic music? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
No,
totally.
I know that. But, in the film, it was particularly,
I see what you mean.
The precisely the point is this, that for me, in a way, I felt, even though I don't understand the music, it looks like it's the dialogue.
Yeah.
It's the contact.
Yeah,
and all the time disco plays and everywhere is the music is everywhere and is what everybody share in a way.
Yeah,
right?
I agree. So. And also with this funny scene with the woman who dresses up as a soldier, the wife who dresses up. Yeah. So that song is this song, Linda, Linda, yeah, Linda. It's like a 70s song. It's a really canonical, it's like you just feel the 70s, And then the last scene with the disco, he's also making the soldiers are getting down, Yeah,
so it was very strong. I love the film. It's amazing. It's really
it's a great film.
I don't want to talk.
Thank you so much for all of your questions and for staying with us through this discussion.